Ministry to Children in Crisis, Module 4, Childhood Trauma and Neurological Development. We want to first of all acknowledge the resources. Dr. T.N. Dayton, Heart Wounds, The Impact of Unresolved Trauma and Grief on Relationships. It is a book. It's a very helpful book. Dr. Linda Burgess Chamberlain with her article entitled The Amazing Brain, Trauma, and the Potential for Healing. Much of what we'll be discussing today is based on Dr. Bruce Perry's work, his early work, and continued work. And this particular article is rather lengthy, Childhood Trauma and Neurobiology of Adaptation and Use-Dependent Development of the Brain, How States Become Traits. Many others have done work in brain development as it relates to trauma or traumatic events, but much of the later work stands on the shoulders of Dr. Bruce Perry. Dr. Philip Rector, who also quotes Perry in his article, The Impact of Violence and Early Trauma on the Developing Brain, and Dr. Adele Wasserman, her work on understanding the effects of childhood trauma on brain development in Native American children. She as well stands on the shoulders of Dr. Perry. Module 4 Objectives. Number 1, we want to discover how the brain develops in sequential and hierarchical fashion, beginning first as an infant in the brainstem and up through the brain through the neocortex. Number 2, to describe how trauma can affect early brain and emotional development. And number 3, articulate T.N. Dayton's therapeutic responses to children who have experienced trauma. Some of the most significant research in the area of childhood trauma and its effect on neurological development is that of Dr. Bruce Perry, who is the faculty in departments of pharmacology and psychiatry at the University of Chicago School of Medicine from 1988 to 1991. From 1992 to 2001, Dr. Perry served as a Trammell Research Professor in Child Psychiatry at the Baylor College of Medicine in Houston, Texas. He is Senior Fellow of the Childhood Trauma Academy, a not-for-profit organization based in Houston. And you can find his work in the World Wide Web at www.childtrauma.org. He's presently adjunct professor, Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences at the Northwestern University School of Medicine in Chicago. His findings have been documented in the paper entitled Childhood Trauma, the Neurobiology of Adaptation and Use-Dependent Development of the Brain, How States Become Traits. Groundbreaking research done during that time period. Later, other works by Dr. Philip Rector, in his work at the 10th National Indian Nations Conference, December 2006, and Adele Wasserman in her paper entitled Understanding the Effects of Childhood Trauma on Brain Development in Native Children. Since all trauma manifests itself as grief, I want to explore how Perry's research informs this present study of children in grief. I want to know how parents and caregivers can recognize those who are most at risk to suffer long-term effects of grief, and how to help them have a measure of hopefulness and imagine a future other than their present experience. As we consider the developing brain, New scientific information suggests that victims of childhood traumas such as abuse, neglect, separation from caregivers, and witnessing violence may suffer from long-term impairment in how their brains work. It's essential that we understand how children are impacted by trauma in order to help children to heal, so says Idell Wasserman. As you grow, so does your brain. Children don't think about their world in the same way as adults do. You cannot explain things to a 10-year-old as you would an adolescent who is 17. Well, why is this? You don't speak to a 19-year-old as you would a 10-year-old, and you relate to a 10-year-old differently than a 1-year-old. And why is this? It is because a child understands more at each level of growth, of their brain growth. It happens because the brain continues to develop after birth, processing experiences and learning. When we were born, the most basic parts of the brain worked completely. This is in order for us to survive our environment. We can survive as infants without understanding the world around us. However, as we get older, it becomes important to understand more complex ideas. So we need to use more parts of our brain as we get older, such as talking, walking, and other skills use different parts of the brain than the portion that simply controls breathing and other simple functions. Consider the following diagrams, where the infant might, instead of saying cookie, would say ookie. They can't formulate the words properly. A little older child can speak well. May I have a cookie, please? Can ask a question. I was impressed by this. A friend of mine who has an infant was sitting in a high chair, and she had taught the child sign language because it's a lower part of the brain usage. Verbal skills weren't available to the child yet because the brain hadn't grown. And so the child would simply put his fingers to his mouth and move it in our direction very quickly to explain that they were through, they were finished eating, or put the hand towards the mouth whenever they wanted to eat. I was just so impressed at this, that this is actually a functional way to teach children to communicate even before verbal skills are available. The brain is composed of many parts or systems that control different functions. While the most basic part of our brain is completely functional at birth, the other parts continue to grow and develop after we are born. The brain is organized so that the basic functions develop first and the most complex functions develop last. The brain develops in order from least towards the bottom, the brainstem, to the most complex, the limbic, the cortical areas of the brain, upper parts of the brain. The brainstem controls the basic functions such as breathing, heart rate, swallowing, digestion, and temperature. Autonomic nervous system, and the effects and levels of alertness, ability to sleep, sense of balance. The limbic area is the part of the central nervous system that seems to be involved in controlling emotion and memory. Specifically, two areas of the limbic system, the amygdala and the hippocampus, seem to be involved in the processing of emotionally charged memories. This is why this area of the brain is so very important as it relates to trauma. And it can get stuck, and different problems can occur when there's a lot of trauma when this part of the brain is developing. As you see, this complexity of function from the bottom towards the top. Initial development of the brain starts soon after conception. The brain continues to grow and develop for many years after birth. In fact, the brain appears to grow until 10 years of age. The brain develops in sequential and hierarchical fashion, as you see here, from less complex, from the brainstem, to the most complex, the limbic and cortical areas. These different areas develop, organize, and become fully functional at different times during childhood. At birth, for example, the brainstem areas responsible for regulating cardiovascular and respiratory function must be intact for the infant to survive. And any malfunction is immediately observable. In contrast, the cortical areas responsible for abstract thought, cognition, have years before they will be needed or fully functional. Thus says Dr. Perry. We all know that physical damage to the brain early in life can severely impact what a child will be able to do throughout their life. An infant who experiences a blow to the head, for example, may never develop the ability to walk or learn complex tasks. In order for the brain to develop normally, it needs to receive signals at certain points of development. Brain development is dependent upon nothing going wrong during these critical periods. Since different parts of the brain develop at different times, different systems of the brain are particularly vulnerable and sensitive to problems or trauma at different times during the child's development. Trauma that occurs while a child's brain is developing may lead to abnormal development of many parts of the brain, not just the part that is developing at the time of the traumatic event. Consider the children that you know. They normally develop sequentially. Most children begin to roll over before they crawl. They crawl before they walk. Preschool children understand many more words than they are able to read. These differences in abilities are directly related to the physical development of the brain. The neurons develop in response to messages sent between cells with chemicals called neurotransmitters. Then this neuron sends this new message to the next neuron, and etc. For example, a child touching a hot stove for the first time. The brain sends a signal from the hand to tell the child that this is hot, so that the child will pull his hand away. This is a different signal from the child touching a cold stove. In each case, the signals are different, which leads to different results. Each time this occurs, the brain sends information to the neurotransmitters to build a file in the brain, so that the next time the child touches the hot object, the same type of information is sent along the neurotransmitters, and the child soon learns not to touch things that are too hot. Repeated experience leads to learning. Therefore, the brain stores information in what is called use-dependent fashion. The more one uses neural pathways or systems, the stronger that pathway becomes. The antithesis is true as well. The less you use a pathway, the weaker it becomes. Just think of a skill that you had as a child but haven't used in a long while. Can you still use that skill? If so, are you as good at doing it now when you stopped doing that thing many years ago? Problems can occur when the same pathways are in constant use, such as when a child is in a constant state of fear. The pathways become sensitized, meaning that they are always ready to be activated with the slightest encouragement from the child's environment. Eventually, even the thought of the event can cause the body to react as if the event itself is actually taking place. This type of sensitization can explain what is called hyperarousal. a symptom often seen in traumatized children. Many children in abusive homes or have experienced repeated emotional trauma or loss, or been witness of traumatic events without being able to leave their environment, suffer many of the same symptoms as returning soldiers who have been deployed as PTSD or post-traumatic stress disorder. One of the key functions of nervous tissue is to store information. All areas of the brain store information related to the functions they mediate. The cortex stores cognitive information, names, faces, facts. The limbic system can store emotional information, fear, pleasure, sadness. Motor vestibular memories such as typing, playing the piano, or riding a bike are stored in other parts of the brain. In the brainstem, the anxiety or arousal states associated with traumatic event can be stored there. The symptoms of PTSD are stored throughout the brain in these various systems and areas. Re-exposure to cues associated with the trauma, such as sights, sounds, and smells, can elicit these stored memories and result in the signs and symptoms of PTSD. Unfortunately, as this event plays itself out again and again in the mind of the child, not only will the thoughts of the event be recalled, but the emotions and the feelings, such as fear and anxiety and pain, of being out of control and threatened, will be re-experienced as well. Each intrusive thought, nightmare, and reenactment in play also re-evokes the emotional or affective memory of being in the midst of that particular threatening event. Neurological memory in early childhood is seen in this particular story. Linda, who is a 37-year-old mother of 5. Her youngest is a 3-month-old girl who has a different father, we'll call him John, than the other 4 children. Linda was very concerned during her pregnancy because she had been physically assaulted by the father of the baby during a previous pregnancy, which resulted in a miscarriage. According to Linda, she ended the relationship with John during the pregnancy because he was attempting to intimidate and control her by telling him the baby wasn't his. The 3-month-old baby nonetheless has been fussy and difficult to calm, possibly showing signs of the stress and trauma experienced by her mother during the pregnancy. Another example is that of dissociative behavior in children, or frozen state. A tribal victim advocate was called to sexual assault victim's house. When the advocate arrived at the victim's home, she was told that the victim's 4-year-old daughter had been sexually assaulted. The advocate called the tribal police, who took the little girl outside the house to wait for the police. While they were waiting, a neighbor rode up and started talking to the advocate about how someone had stolen his vehicle. The advocate informed him that the police should be arriving soon and he could report the theft. At that point, the neighbor jumped off his horse and began to beat up another man who he thought had stolen his horse. The advocate was concerned about the 4-year-old witnessing such violence. However, the young girl just sat there with no emotion or expression on her face. Violence was such a common occurrence in her life that she had learned to block her feelings and her reactions. The state and effect memories elicited on a non-conscious state. Another example, David is a 9-year-old boy. From age 2 to 6, he was sexually abused by his father. This abuse induced severe physical injuries. At age 6, he was removed from the family. At age 8, he was seriously injured in a fall. He suffered from serious brain injury resulting from in a coma state for 8 months following the injury. He continues to be difficult to arouse and is nonverbal. He exhibits no form of meaningful communication. However, in the presence of his biological father, he began to scream, moan, and his heart rate increased dramatically. Audio tapes of his biological father elicit a similar response. The scent of his father, one of his father's shirts, resulted in similar agitated behavior and physiological hyperarousal. These memories are stored in lower parts of the brain and do not require cognitive memory or consciousness to be expressed. The second example demonstrates there is another reaction to threat that is called dissociative response, and that in the case of the little girl in the tribal victim event where she just sat there. Children, for example, are not well equipped to fight or to flee when threatened with an abusive or violent situation. Perry observes that in the initial stages of distress, a young child will use vocalization, such as crying, to get the caretaker to know that they are under threat. This is a successful adaptive response if the caretaker comes and either fights for or flees with the young threatened child. Crying, therefore, is a developmentally appropriate response to the threat that the child, when he's unable or she is unable to avoid. Unfortunately, crying infrequently will bring an adult to defend a traumatized child. However, for many maltreated children, crying for help from a potential trauma is doomed to fail, since the parent is often the source of the trauma. In the absence of appropriate caretaker response, from their initial alarm outcry, the child eventually, after many painful disappointments, will abandon this behavior, a defeat or a surrender response. In the face of a persisting threat, depending upon the age of the child and the nature of the threat, the child will move along the hyperarousal continuum, the child's version of fight or flight, or into a dissociative continuum. In one case, freezing or oppositional defiant behaviors. The first reaction in the face of a continuing threat, instead of crying, may then be to freeze. The adaptive advantage of this is clear. Freezing allows better sound localization, keener visual observation, an environment scan for potential threat. In addition, lack of movement is a form of camouflage. It's very effective with animals, for example. And it reduces the chance of attracting a predator. So a child may just freeze so as not to be seen. Children who have sensitized dissociative pattern will often use this freezing mechanism when they are feeling anxious. The more anxious a child feels, the quicker the child will move from anxious to threatened, and from threatened to terrorized. If sufficiently terrorized, the freezing may escalate into complete disassociation. Among the constellation of symptoms associated with trauma response in adults is disassociation. Disassociation is simply disengaging from stimuli in the external world and attending to the internal world. Traumatized children use a variety of dissociative techniques. Children report going to a different place, assuming persona of heroes or animals, and a sense of watching a movie that I was in, or just floating, they might say. Classic depersonalization, or derealization responses. Observers will report these children as numb, robotic, non-reactive. They appear to be daydreaming, acting like he or she was not there, staring off into space with a glazed look. If immobilization, inescapability, or pain is involved, the dissociative responses will become more prominent. What are some implications for caregivers? How can we as caregivers help? What are the implications for children who are traumatized by grief? When we hear statements like children are resilient, or they will get over it, or they didn't even know what was happening, we need to be aware of signs as described here by the children may be affected by a traumatic event more than adults around them realize. Often adults, when recounting an event, describe the children's responses as being unattached or non-reactive behaviors as not being affected, or rather than the surrender response. Statements like children get over it. They have no choice if they are to survive. Children are not resilient. Children are malleable. In the process of getting over it, elements of their true emotional, behavioral, and cognitive and social potential are diminished. Some percentage of capacity is lost. A piece of the child is lost forever. Linda Burgess Chamberlain has outlined for us in her article, The Amazing Brain, Trauma and the Potential for Healing, 6 basic facts for adults if we are to help. She states that a baby's brain is a flower ready to bloom. She uses a metaphor of the flower. She says first impressions last a lifetime. A baby's brain will blossom like a flower from lots of positive, nurturing experiences with you or their caregiver. Negative experiences have the opposite effect on early brain development, much like the flower that wilts from neglect. Early trauma can leave a lasting imprint on the developing brain. The younger a child is, the more vulnerable their brain is to the effects of trauma. So how can we help? She lists 6 basic facts about trauma and brain development. Number 1, she calls surviving or thriving. The building blocks of the brain develop from the bottom to the top. When children feel unsafe or threatened, they spend more time in the lower building blocks of the brain, focusing on survival. This can lead to changes in the brain, including less development of the upper brain, smaller brain size, fewer brain connections. The developing brain can become oversensitized to stress, and children experiencing early trauma are often easily overwhelmed by minor stressors such as changing in their schedule or routine. They have difficulty soothing or calming themselves. The following problem behaviors are common among children who are experiencing trauma: difficulty with focusing or paying attention, anxious, unable to settle down, bullying or other aggressive behaviors. A second basic fact is that trauma interferes with learning. When children feel calm and safe, they focus their energy on learning. With children who are dealing with trauma, they're focusing on the chronic state of crisis. They focus on trying to feel okay or normal. This compromises their ability to learn. Traumatized children have more speech problems and difficulty learning on how to read. Third, childhood PTSD hurts the brain. And this is really, really important. When post-traumatic stress disorder occurs, the brain gets stuck in the trauma and it relives it over and over again. Reminders of the trauma can trigger a flood of stress hormones, such as cortisol, before the child even knows what is happening. Reminders of the trauma might be a sound or a smell, such as what the child ate for dinner the night that mommy and daddy got really mad. High levels of stress hormones interfere with brain development and learning, so that it becomes kind of like a cork. It gets stuck. Symptoms of childhood PTSD include zoning out, withdrawing, sleep problems, night terrors, repeated night awakenings, loss of developmental skills such as a child who is learning to speak suddenly stops talking, violent play such as acting out threats and physical attacks with toys over and over again. Number 4, trauma can lead to other health problems as well, such as bedwetting, stomach problems, chronic headaches. Trauma also takes its toll on children's emotional health. Depression, anxiety disorders, behavioral problems are not uncommon among traumatized children. But all is not lost. You can make a difference. Healthy relationship with caring adults can protect children from effects of trauma. Opportunities for children to talk about what happened or play out their feelings about the trauma can start the healing process. Allow the child to tell their story without pressuring them to talk. They also need to know that they need to hear from caring adults that it's not their fault. Acknowledging their feelings with statements such as, that sounds like it was really scary for you, or it sounds like you were very worried when the police came. Acknowledging those feelings can be very healing for children. And it's never too late. Remember, we can rewire and grow our brains over our entire lifetime. Every day we are learning more about the brain's ability to heal. The way we live and the quality of relationships we have can either help or hinder the potential of our brains to grow and to heal. Wasserman shares guidelines from Perry in her article for helping traumatized children who experience grief. It can be very helpful for us as we as adults seek to help. She says, first of all, do not be afraid to talk about the traumatic event. Some of this will be overlap with Chamberlain's information that we just looked at. Use language that the child will understand. The child will experience and process the very same material differently at different times following the trauma. In the long run, the opportunity to reprocess many times will facilitate healthy coping. Provide a consistent, predictable pattern for the day. As in most cases of grief and trauma, children, in order to heal, need consistent patterns, consistent structure in their lives, since their lives were before out of control. Be nurturing, comforting, and affectionate, but be sure that this is the appropriate context. Discuss your expectations for behavior and your style of discipline with the child. They need rules, they need structure. Talk with the child, give them age-appropriate information. Watch closely for signs for reenactment in play, in drawing, art, and behaviors, and avoidance. Being withdrawn, daydreaming, avoiding other children, physiological hyperactivity such as anxiety, sleep problems, behavioral impulsivity. All traumatized children exhibit some combination of these symptoms in the acute post-traumatic period. Give them a safe space in order to talk and to play. Protect them. Give the child choices to empower them and give them some sense of control. If you have questions, certainly ask for help. Always, if you don't know, please refer and get professional help if needed. Further research suggests that adult caregivers can assist children to rethink or reframe their trauma from a distance as they retell their story. Caregivers can assist the children to rethink or reframe their trauma from a distance as they retell their story. At first, it may increase the anxiety level and seemingly be an impossibility to even think or visualize the trauma. This is where therapists can help the child to back off of the event by beginning to visualize what it would look like outside of the house where the event occurred. And if that's too close, down the street. As comfort levels are achieved, the child might very slowly but surely come closer to the house. Maybe look into the house to see the people involved there. Maybe even come into the house eventually and begin to imagine what it would be like being there again. In this way, children are helped to begin to use higher brain functioning rather than the lower reactive parts of the brain to the stimuli surrounding their pain. The goal is to help them begin to reframe their trauma and retrain the brain to think cognitively and to ask questions. What would it be like to say to fill in the blank, dad, uncle, mom, name a name? What would it be like to say to your Uncle John if you had the opportunity? What would it be like to talk with your dad if you had the opportunity? What would you like to say to them? What would you like for them to tell you? What would a healthy environment or family look like? In doing so, they will begin to use the upper parts of their brain and cognition, imagination about choices, alternatives, and possibilities for a future reality. As this is repeated, there is then a new normal for hopefulness. Tyne Daly, in her helpful book, in the section on the personal journey, gives helpful advice for helping children traumatized by grief experiences. In the chapter entitled The Personal Journey, she cites several exercises to help retrain the brain to think differently about their trauma or abusive situation. I'm going to list a few of these. First of all is process pages. This may be in the form of journaling or writing in an uninhibited, free-flowing manner. She states that we hear through the process of defensive exclusion. This theory holds that part of the mind stands in the gateway of consciousness, making split-second decisions as to what material will be taken in consciously and what material will be relegated to psychic storage bins or filing cabinets. Journaling trains the mind to observe its own process. In writing, in doing so, you can choose to deal with painful memories and feelings in a new way. She says people who understand their own insides are in a better position to make the kinds of choices both on a daily basis and for a larger life plan that are tailored to suit their particular needs and wishes. Another tool, she says, that can be helpful is that of a photograph dialogue. She says go through the family album or the box full of photographs and select a photograph of yourself at some point in your life that speaks to you. You can illuminate issues and feelings related to that particular time in your life. by creating a dialogue with yourself as depicted in the picture at the time the photograph was taken, and then as you are today. You can begin to understand how a circumstance may have affected you. Then write a monologue about yourself. For example, this is Lynette. This is a picture of me with my mother and my in-laws. And then a dialogue to yourself about the picture and others in the picture. Maybe ask some questions like this. What feelings come up as you look at this picture? And write about that. What do you imagine the people, including yourself, are thinking? What do you imagine they would like to say? What would you like to say to yourself or anyone else in this picture? What does this picture mean or symbolize to you? Why did you pick this picture? What part of yourself in this photo would you like to keep? What part of yourself would you like to let go of? What strengths do you see in yourself in this photo? And those are just a few of the ideas. Another example would be that of a letter writing experience. This letter may not be sent to anyone. It is an attempt to say what you may have always wanted to say or needed to say to someone about unresolved feelings. And maybe it may just be someone you may never have the opportunity to write to. Maybe they're deceased, or maybe they're estranged, maybe live in another part of the world. You don't have to send this to anyone, but pick someone that you need to express feelings to and write out your feelings in the form of a letter or greeting. Dear Dad. And don't hold back. Just pour it out in this letter. And seal it up. May want to burn it. May want to bury it somewhere. Many people feel healing by writing a letter and then tearing it up, flushing it down the toilet. Or, like I said, burning it up afterwards. You may want to keep it. You may also want to write a letter that you would have liked to receive. Maybe Dad is deceased. Maybe Mom is deceased. Grandpa, Grandma, or somebody else. And you would have wished they would have said something to you. What would you like to have heard from them? Maybe you're having a conversation. Write down the dialogue. Dear son, dear daughter, I miss you. I wasn't there for you. How do you feel, Dad? Maybe you could have a dialogue in this particular letter. We have only touched the hem of the garment in regard to trauma and brain development. I am by no means an expert in the field. I don't pretend to be. However, it is my hope that this might serve as an introduction to a very interesting and important field as we consider the mandate to be intentional in our compassionate care for children who have experienced many forms of trauma, including the trauma of grief. The situations described here may be more extreme forms of trauma than we would ever encounter with children in a hospital setting. However, we will hopefully be more aware as we visit with and seek to minister to children whom we encounter who are in crisis. Dr. Perry says your actions can have dramatic impact on children in your community, and by supporting the efforts of effective organizations, your actions can impact thousands of children in this generation and in generations to follow. He suggests that we choose to help in a way that works for us. You may want to work directly with maltreated children in your community. There are children that need the gift of attention, respect, instruction, comfort, and hope. So many children from abusive settings have lost hope. Even brief interactions with respectful, honest, and nurturing adults can be helpful to the abused or traumatized child, allowing them to know that adults can be kind. There are many ways to find children who need your time. Volunteer to be a foster parent. Volunteer in a CASA program, child-appointed special advocate, where you can be a help to a child who's in foster care. To rock a crack-addicted infant in the hospital, to teach a child to read, to be an aide at the local public school, to answer phones at battered women's shelter. All of these settings, in all of these, you can enrich the life of a child. You can give a child hope. It is my belief that being intentional and showing care and concern for children during a trauma of grief, whether it be the death of a parent, or death of a pet, a grandparent, sibling, or friend, will aid to relieve the symptoms of the traumatic event by affirming their loss. Significant others near them as adults, parents, and caregivers can aid by giving the child alternative realities of existence with a view toward a future of hopefulness. Consider these words of Arashani, quoted by Tien Dayton in a poem called The Unbroken. There's a brokenness out of which comes the unbroken, a shatteredness out of which blooms the unshatterable. There's a sorrow beyond all grief which leads to joy, and a fragility out of whose depths emerges strength. There is a hollow place too vast for words, through which we pass with each loss, out of whose darkness we are sanctioned into being. There is a cry deeper than all sound, whose serrated edges cut the heart as we break open to the place inside which the unbreakable and whole, while learning to sing. Our Module 4 objectives. We have discovered how the brain develops in sequential and hierarchical fashion. We have described how trauma can affect early brain and emotional development. And you'll want to articulate Tien Dayton's therapeutic responses to children who've experienced trauma. Well, this concludes Module 4. You'll want to read the articles that have been uploaded for you, the books that have been assigned, complete all assessments that you will find for this module, and participate in any forums that we will have. Again, I want to thank you for your participation in this class. We're about halfway through. I look forward to next week with Module 5 as we begin to look at the different aspects of grief as it relates to different age groups. May God bless you and have a great week.